So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to the Economics of Migration seminar. Today I will present my job market paper, The Labor Market Effects of an Expected Amnesty for Undocumented Workers. First of all, let me introduce the topic of undocumented migration. In 2009, around 50 million of migrants were undocumented around the world. The Pew Research Center estimated that European countries hosted between 3.8 and 4.6 million of undocumented migrants, and in 2016, and in 2019 the US hosted around 7 million of undocumented workers. This was an estimation from Migration Policy Institute. So in order to tackle the issues arising from irregular migration, for instance, an increase in the crime rates, labor exploitation, lack of health assistance, most developed countries grant amnesties to undocumented workers. European countries granted several amnesties for undocumented workers. However, most of the time, these amnesties were tailored to a very specific group of undocumented workers, and so the numbers were very small. We have only 3 examples of large amnesties in Greece, in Italy, and Spain, where around more than around 200,000 of undocumented migrants were regularized. There is a huge literature that studies the positive effects of an amnesty on the labor market outcomes of amnestied workers. However, we don't have a full understanding of the effects of the regularization on the labor market outcomes of natives. Indeed, some papers show no effects on the labor market outcomes of natives, and other papers show a negative effect on the low-skilled workers. More into detail, Morras et al. 2020 and Deport et al. 2018 show that the Spanish and the Italian amnesty do not have a negative effect on the labor market outcomes of natives, respectively. And while Albert 2021 and Bahar et al. 2021 show a small negative effect on low-skilled workers. So in order to add a piece to this puzzle, I evaluate the effect of an amnesty policy for undocumented workers on the labor market outcomes of native workers. To perform the analysis, I exploit the 2002 Italian amnesty, which granted a work visa to around 640,000 undocumented workers. The Italian policy introduced the possibility of regularizing undocumented workers for employers and increases the penalties for hiring undocumented migrants. I exploit this joint treatment to estimate to identify the effect on the labor market outcomes of natives. In particular, I exploit the heterogeneity in the probability of regularizing an undocumented migrant across markets. Furthermore, I look at the effect in the very short run to get rid of the bias stemming from potential general equilibrium effects. Basically, in the medium and in the long run, native workers might change market, might change occupation to supply labor, where to supply labor, to offset the negative effects of the amnesty. So for this reason, I look only at very short run to estimate the effect of the amnesty on labor market outcomes of natives. Before stating the contributions, my contributions, I compare the amnesties among these three main countries, these countries, Italy, Spain, and US, that experienced the three largest one-shot amnesties among developed countries in 2002, 2005, and 1986, respectively. All the governments increased the penalties for hiring undocumented migrants after the policy implementation and required a minimum stay to apply for the amnesty. However, Italian and Spanish amnesties also require that employers are in charge of applying for the amnesty, while in the US, migrants were free to regularize by themselves. Finally, US and Spanish governments announced the amnesty 3 months before opening the regularization window, while the Italian government implemented the reform just a few days after the announcement. So there is, it's very unlikely there is an anticipatory effect of the amnesty in Italy. So for these reasons, Italian amnesty provides the best scenario to understand firms' behavior, and in particular, provides the best scenario to understand the effect of the amnesty on the labor demand for native workers. My contributions are threefold. The first one is I develop a novel theoretical framework to show the trade-off between undocumented and undeclared workers. Undocumented workers are foreign workers without a visa, a work visa. Undeclared workers are workers with the right to work, but they work in the informal sector. Second, I use a monthly observations to get rid of general equilibrium effects that could bias estimates towards zero, as I already said before. The third contribution is that I show that the regularization program has a small but significant negative effect on the employment of low-skilled native workers. In particular, the effect is greater for youngsters and for workers living in areas with a high concentration of low-skilled workers. This is the roadmap of the paper. I've already stated my motivation. Then I will introduce a little bit of historical background, institutional background of the amnesty. Then I will give you the intuition about what's going on in the labor market by developing a novel theoretical framework. Then I present the data, I show you the empirical strategy, an event study estimator with continuous treatment. And here I anticipate some results. A 1% increase in the foreign employment lowers by 0.04% the native employment. Then I will conclude. The historical background. In June 2001, a center-right coalition won the general elections. This was the first time that two parties of the center-right coalition included in their manifesto some anti-immigration reforms. However, a new immigration law was not on the desk of the parliament up to 9/11 attacks. After the 9/11, they started to write down the new immigration law. This immigration law was approved by the Chamber of Deputies and in February 2002, and was approved by the Senate in July 2002. Up to this moment, the two anti-immigration parties of the center-right coalition were against a regularization for undocumented workers working employed in the private sector. they included only an amnesty for domestic workers up to July 2002. And after a year, a big discussion about approving or not regularization for undocumented workers employed in private sector, the two anti-immigration parties agreed on a regularization for migrants, for undocumented migrants working in the private sector only few days before the new penalties for hiring undocumented migrants were effective. So they opened an amnesty lasting from September 2002 to November 2002. As already said, the immigration law increased the penalties for hiring undocumented workers. The new penalties became effective from September 2002. Furthermore, the Italian government granted the amnesty only a few days before these penalties became effective, and the regularization period lasts until November 2002. In order to apply for the amnesty, the application must fulfill some rules. Basically, employers are in charge of applying for the amnesty. This increases the monopsony power of employers. Then a proof of employment of each undocumented worker of the past 3 months. So undocumented workers have been working for the same firm over the past 3 months. So the labor supply of undocumented foreigners was fixed before the policy implementation. And finally, employers have to register an employment agreement with amnested workers that last at least 1 year. This is the result of the amnesty. At the end of November 2002, the number of applications was around 700,000, and the number of regularized workers was around 630,000, and half of them were working in the private sector as employees. Concha 2005 shows that more than 50% of regularized migrants work in the construction, manufacturing, and hospitality industries. And Zucchetti 2004 shows that the largest share of amnested workers is employed in the central and the north regions of Italy.
Sorry, if I may interrupt you, Salvatore. If you go back to the previous slide.
Okay.
So you said 630,000 workers were regularized. Half of them were employees. So the other half were self-employed, and they submitted themselves the application? Who submitted it for them? The
other half were basically domestic workers.
So like the household submitted an application for them then?
Basically, yes, the household submitted the application for them. And domestic workers cannot work in the private sector as employee, only as domestic worker.
I see, thank you.
You're welcome. These figures shows the number of new hirings of ex-EU workers between January 1999 and December 2004. Y-axis shows the new hirings of ex-EU workers, the x-axis shows the time, and as you can see, there is a huge spike in September 2002. I will exploit this exogenous variation to identify the effect of the amnesty on labor market outcomes of meetings. So let me, I will give you more here an intuition about what's going on in the labor market by using a novel theoretical framework. From a neoclassical point of view, the increase in the labor cost for hiring undocumented workers should lead to an increase of undeclared but documented workers. As already said before, undocumented workers are foreigners without a work visa. Undeclared workers are workers that could work in the formal occupation but work in the informal sector. However, the large number of applications for the amnesty shows that employers decide to regularize their undocumented employees. I give two explanations for this behavior. The first, a shortage of labor supply for hard labor jobs. The second one is that the higher cost of hiring undocumented migrants leads to a trade-off between formal and informal labor input, such that firms regularize foreign workers and hire more undeclared native workers. In my theoretical model, I summarize both explanations. So let me go more into details of the theoretical model. I assume a representative firm that sells an homogeneous good in both the formal and informal market. I assume that declared and undeclared labor inputs produce only goods sold in the formal and informal markets, respectively. Then I assume that workers are divided in several productivity-specific groups. At the end, the firm sets a productivity level, a productivity threshold, such that each group of workers below the threshold work in the formal occupations, and all the workers above this threshold work in the formal occupation. At the threshold, the firm is indifferent to hire formally or informally workers. So the model wants to highlight the trade-off between formal and informal labor inputs, and to understand what is the impact of an increase in the penalties for hiring undocumented workers on the decision to hire of hiring a worker in the formal or with a formal or an informal agreement. This is the production function. I show the production function for the informal production function. This is a CS production function with two labor inputs. The total hours, the total amount of hours worked, the total amount of hours spent at work by informal migrants and by informal natives, and each group, the total amount of hours spent at work by workers with a productivity theta is equal to H theta, that is the total amount of hours spent at work by each worker with a productivity theta times the labor supply of workers with a productivity level theta. And then each theta is equal to C, that is the possible, the available amount of working hours within a large enough time span, for instance, a month, a quarterly, times the productivity. So what I'm saying here, that the most productive workers are gonna to spend much time at work than the low productive workers. Finally, L theta J is the total labor supply of workers with productivity theta that is equal to the total labor supply of group J times the density function of theta. I assume that theta J is between 0 and 1, and the formal production is the same, but the extremes of integration are between theta upper bar J and 1. So the cost function, this is the cost function. W is the nominal hourly wage, T is the payroll tax rate, and alpha is the probability of being expected. HF and HI are the total amount of time spent at work by formal and informal workers, respectively. Finally, EFM theta and EFM theta M are the expected penalties for hiring undeclared natives and undocumented foreigners, respectively. These are the total hours worked by formal and informal workers. As you can see, the total hours worked by formal workers are the sum of all hours spent at work by formal migrants and formal natives and otherwise. Let me stress more on the cost function, that is the novelty of this theoretical framework. So basically, the expected penalty for hiring either undeclared or undocumented workers is the following. Basically, it's the integral between 0 and theta upper bar j of fj times the probability of detecting a productivity specific worker and times the labor supply of each productivity specific group of workers. What I'm saying here that the probability of detecting a productivity worker is an increasing function of the productivity. That means that workers with a high productivity level are more likely to be detected during an inspection than low-skilled workers, because they spend more time at work than low-skilled workers. And this is the main novelty of the paper, because other paper assumes that the probability of inspection and of detecting a worker is exogenous, while I endogenize this probability. This is the profit maximization problem. P1 and P2 are the prices of goods sold in the formal and in informal market, respectively. And so the representative firm maximized the profit function to find the marginal productivity for migrants and natives. To solve the maximization problem, assume that the probability of detecting a productivity specific worker is linear in productivity, and workers' productivity is distributed uniformly. Okay, this is the solution of the maximization problem. So theta upper bar j is the marginal productivity where the representative firm is indifferent to hire formally or informally the group of workers with this specific productivity level. Taking the ratio between the threshold for native workers and the threshold for foreign workers, I got the equation 11. That basically is, this equation shows that an increase in the fine for hiring undocumented workers leads to an increase of the ratio between the two productivity thresholds. This means that you in labor firms can experience an increase in theta upper bar n, a decrease in theta upper bar m, or both of them. An increase in theta upper bar n means that lower native, that there is a decrease in the formal, there is a decrease in the employment of formal native workers, because if theta upper bar n moves on the right, if you imagine a uniform distribution, this means that the more native workers are employed informally. This ratio or an increase, a decrease in theta upper bar m means an increase in the formal employment of foreign workers, or both of them. So this gives you the intuition about the trade-off between formal and informal labor inputs. Questions?
Yeah, there is actually a question. If you want to take it now, I will read it out loud. So Sarah Winton is asking, she's saying, typically models of informality focus on the labor market being segmented into formal and informal sectors. She's asking whether classifying firms as operating and selling output in formal versus informal markets change the results compared to traditional assumptions.
Okay, thanks for the question. Basically, if you assume that a firm operates only in the informal market, in the formal sector, or in the informal sector, either in the formal sector or in the informal sector, this changes the result, because here I'm assuming that a firm sells its product in both markets. So basically, this changed the result for sure. So now, what I want to highlight here, that a firm can operate in both sectors, and this creates the trade-off. I hope I answered the question. Jeremy?
To quickly follow up on that, I think you haven't combined formal and informal production into a single good, right? They're kind of separate sectors. There's no scope for a firm to substitute towards formal production and away from informal production. Is that true?
Sorry, I didn't get it. Sorry, can you repeat?
So I think, if I understand correctly, you're assuming that there's a fixed amount of production in the formal and the informal sector.
Yes.
Whereas a margin of response might be that firms shift towards formal production and away from informal production in response to the amnesty. So
yes,
a typical model might have formal and informal labor combined in a CES kind of framework to produce output. And I don't think you have that.
No, I do not have that, but basically it's included in the model, because if you think that theta, the amnesty is going to drive theta upper bar M so low at 0, basically they will produce only in the formal sector. This is the sense, and if there is no effect on theta upper bar N, basically the firms will operate only in the formal sector. So, I mean, it's included in the model if this is the case.
Okay.
Okay. I'm a little bit out of time, so I will skip this. So in order to perform the empirical analysis, I use administrative data from a work histories Italian panel, a 1% sample of individual work histories from Italian Social Security System archives from 2001 to 2002. I use the information on the duration of the contracts to create monthly data, and I do not have the information about which migrants has been regularized with the reform, but in order to detect regularized migrants, I check whether migrants have signed a labor contract with the following characteristics. They have not been employed regularly within the same firm over the past 3 months, and the contract must last at least 1 year and start between September and November 2002. To check whether the match works between the actual and the predicted regularized migrants, I cross-validate the characteristics of my sample with the ones displayed in other papers that use population data. I use the following characteristics: nationalities, province, and firm characteristics, and basically the match works. I will not go to the checks, but trust me, it works. Okay, then I dropped women, since the regularized migrants work in hard labor jobs, and it's very unlikely that women compete with regularized migrants in the labor market. I dropped the public sector, the agricultural industry, and the fishing industry. In particular, I dropped the agricultural industry and the fishing industry because I do not have a representative sample of blue-collar workers. I dropped individuals belonging to the first and the last percentile of the wage distribution. Finally, I select only blue and white collars between 18 and 65 years old. These are the summary statistics. As you can see, as usual, former legal foreigners are younger, the natives earn less, are more likely to work in hard labor jobs, and they work for smaller firms. But when you look at the amnested foreigners, they are even younger, they earn less than formal legal foreigners, and they work more in the construction industry and for smaller firms than legal foreigners. As I showed before, in equation 11, I display this ratio of the productivity threshold of natives to the one of foreigners. Using log linearize this ratio in order to give an intuition about what's going on after the regularization. I proxy the gap by using the employment and the average wage of foreigner and native workers. This figure shows on the left hand side y-axis the foreign native log wage gap. On the right hand y-axis, I have the foreign native log employment gap, and on x-axis I have the time. As you can see, there is a drop, and in absolute term, an increase in the foreign native log wage gap, and a decrease in the foreign log employment gap after the amnesty. So there are two effects. The employment effects, basically amnesty reduces the foreign native employment gap in the formal sector. However, a fraction of the reduction might be due to a crowding out effect of native workers. And the wage effect, so regularized workers earn less than both former documented workers and native workers. This explains a larger share of the increase in the wage gap. However, a small fraction might be due to a crowding out effect of the low wage earners in the legal sector. So,
sorry, you have less than 5 minutes, approximately 5 minutes.
Okay, so let me go through the empirical strategy. On the left-hand side, I have the labor market outcome of individual I within cell C at time tau, where tau indicates the month-year period. On the right-hand side, I have the share of regularized foreigners within cell C at year Y, and I include a cell month, cell year, month-year fixed effects. Let me define the markets. I assume that firms have the same probability of applying for the amnesty if they have the same probability of being inspected. Therefore, I define a market, SL, as the collection of all firms having the same inspection likelihood. But since I do not observe the actual inspection probabilities of each firm, I use three characteristics to define markets: firm size, province, and sector, and industry, sorry. And basically, I assume that firms belonging in this market cell have the same likelihood of applying for the amnesty. Okay, so I have some tricks to identification, but I will not go to this. Basically, the most important part here, I select only workers that do not change markets within a year. Then I run the estimated the regression, also including the entire sample and basically the results all. So this is the first result, the employment effects. This is the effects of the amnesty on the probability of having a formal occupation for native workers. On the y-axis, I show the coefficients of the event study estimation of the estimates, and on the x-axis, I have the months. As you can see, there is no anticipatory effect of the amnesty. but there is a negative trend in the probability of having a formal occupation for native workers after the policy implementation. And 1% increase in the amnesty, in the share of amnested workers, leads to a 0.04% decrease in the probability of having a formal occupation for native workers. Then I use the age groups to show the heterogeneity of these effects, and which are the age groups mostly affected by the amnesty. As you can see, youngsters and elderly are the most affected groups by the amnesty, probably because amnested foreigners are substitute of youngsters and elderly in hard labor occupations, but they complement the middle-aged workers. This is at extensive margin. When I run a regression, when I study the effect of the amnesty at intensive margin by using the probability of having a part-time job, I observe that the amnesty affects the probability of having a part-time job of middle-aged workers. There is an increase in the probability of having a part-time job for middle-aged workers. So at extensive margin, there is an effect for youngsters and elderly, but at intensive margin, there is an effect on middle-aged workers. So up to now, I showed you the effect on the employment, and I can claim that the low-skilled workers in hard labor occupations are the most affected ones by the amnesty. So in order to fix this result, I ran the regression, I performed the analysis on wages. And as you can see, basically, if the low-skilled workers are crowded out from the labor market, the average wage within each market should increase. And so, as you can see from these tables, after the policy implementation, there is an increase in the log of wages. But when I include the individual characteristics, the effect gets smaller and less significant. And as you can imagine, the most affected groups are the youngsters and the elderly. In order to check whether the wage effect is only a compositional effect while the employment effect persists, I perform the analysis at individual level. On the left-hand side, I use the yearly difference of labor market outcomes within each month, and I include the individual fixed effect, the monthly fixed effects, and the monthly trend. I interact this monthly trend with individual fixed effects. As you can see from this table, the employment effect persists even if it's a little bit smaller, while the wage effect fades away. So I can claim here that the low-skilled workers are crowded out from the legal occupation, the formal occupations, and because there is no effect on wages, and there is only an effect on the probability of being employed. I ran this heterogeneity analysis across areas because in the northern regions there is low concentration of low-skilled workers, and as you can see, the employment effect is greater in the southern regions of Italy, while the wage effect is larger within central and northern regions of Italy. So the southern regions with a high concentration of low-skilled workers are the most affected one by the amnesty. So I ran some robustness checks, but let me conclude that the time is running out. So basically, a sudden increase of labor costs of the undocumented workers leads employers to regularize migrants. And employers react to this increase by reshaping their labor demands for formal foreign workers and native workers, preferring low-cost foreign labor in formal occupations. Cheaper foreign workers substitute low-skilled natives. The substitution effect of legal native workers is mostly larger within geographical areas with a high fraction of low-skilled workers. There are some policy implications for Italy. In 2002, around 56% of 25-64 years old population have attained below upper secondary education. In 2019, this share was around 38%. So an inflow of young, low-skilled migrants might reduce the labor market tightness in some segments of the labor market. Hence, the Italian government should provide better incentives for natives and migrants to accumulate more human capital. Okay, I finished. That's all.
Right, thank you. I think, Elsa, perhaps we can introduce the next session, or maybe if there are some questions from the floor.
Yeah, I guess we have time for a short discussion if you have something to add to this presentation.
Well, I do have a question myself, while maybe some other people want to ask some question. So you showed that when you were doing by age, I think that was the employment effect, that the extensive margin was sort of like polarized among youngsters and older people. And I was wondering whether you had the chance to check whether, for instance, the youngsters effect is driven by, I don't know, construction sector, while the older is, I don't know, I would say elderly care, or the kind of workers who are not employed by private firms, but they're domestic. Yeah, domestic workers, that's what I meant. Did you have the chance to check the sectors behind this effect?
Basically, I do not have domestic workers in my data set. I only have employees in my data set. So the effect is completely driven by the three main industries where Amnesty, where the undocumented workers were regularized, basically.
Okay. Yeah, perhaps some of our panelists would like to make some comments, or I don't know, some remark.
I would have one if I can.
Sure, go ahead.
So sorry, my camera is again not working. So thanks for the talk. I was just wondering, your model talks a lot about natives moving into informality. Is there something your data allows to say about that?
Basically, I do not have this information in my data set, as it's a common problem in this kind of informal labor market literature. So I do not have this information about informal workers. So at the end of the story, native workers could be unemployment after the policy implementation, but also they can work in the informal sector. But the story is that if you imagine a search and matching model where you have a fixed number of vacancies, and they are all filled by new legalized foreign workers, the formal labor transitions could lower, and so native workers are more likely to accept jobs in informal occupations. But this only from a theoretical point of view. I do not have any information about informal occupation.
And do you have a working time? Like, do you know how many hours the contracts, like how many hours actually the workers worked?
I didn't have the actual number of hours worked. As I showed you, I use the part-time contracts to show the intensive margin effects on middle-aged workers. But I do not have the actual amount of hours worked.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question. Good.
So I have a question about the empirical specification. So I
Yes.
think the right-hand side variable you used was the, the percent change in the documented migrant workforce, I think. Yeah, amnesties over a total number of immigrants who are regularized. And I'm wondering why is immigration, the total number of immigrants in the denominator there? So I'm wondering, like, if the goal is to say, I guess an intuitive way to think about the magnitude of effects for me would be, is there one-to-one replacement for every one documented worker that enters a firm, does one documented native exit? And this doesn't really tell us that, right? Because it also depends on the share, on the number of regularized immigrants starting off in each location. So I guess I'm wondering if you could do something similar, but just have the total working population in the denominator. And if you think we would learn something else from that.
Yeah, basically I do the analysis using the share of amnested foreigners in order to get rid of some indigeneity issues. Because if I use the sum, basically there are some outliers within some cells that could drive the estimates. And so I want to get rid of this kind of problem of outliers by considering how much large is the labor market in that cell in that specific year. That's why I use it.
What I'm saying is to just replace the denominator with like the total working population, maybe at the start of the period.
Yeah.
So I think the measurement is similar. I think it would be less sensitive to,
Yeah. I run the regression using also the total labor supply within each cell in a given year, and basically estimates do not change so much as I remember. Maybe a little bit because you have the fraction is lower, but if you make some computation, basically the effect is more or less the same.
Okay. Yeah, I think it would be helpful to show that so you can give some interpretation of the magnitude of results.
Okay, thanks for the comment.
All right, we are right on time. I'd say maybe Elsa, we can introduce the next speaker, and then if some people want to stick around, we can have some further discussion.